Isang pangarap ang bumuo sa atin, isang awitin nating sariwain. USEP naming liyag, tatak ng ating pagkamatatag. Kay layo-layo ng iyong ninakbay, at kay rami-rami ng binago mong buhay. Kasama mo kami sa pag-akay, anuman ang hamong darating sa buhay. Tayo na't sumabay sa tugtugan, kahit milya-milyang agwat ang pagitan. Nagkakaisa sa indak katawitan niyo sa piano, tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. Tayo na't sumabay sa tugtugan, kahit milya-milyang agwat ang pagitan. Nagkakaisa sa indak katawitan niyo sa piano, tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. Tahanan ka ng iba't ibang tribo at ng kulturang yaman ng Pilipino. Pinapamalas ang talento mong tangi, binhian ka ng mga bagong bayani. Tayo na't sumabay sa tugtugan, kahit milya-milyang agwat ang pagitan. Nagkakaisa sa indak katawitan niyo sa piano, tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. Tayo na't sumabay sa tugtugan, kahit milya-milyang agwat ang pagitan. Nagkakaisa sa indak katawitan niyo sa piano, tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. O aking nalipad sa iyong pagpakisasakay, saan mang sulok ng mundo tayo ay lilipad. O aking lalipad sa iyong pagpakisasakay, saan mang sulok ng mundo tayo ay lilipad. Tayo na't sumabay sa tugtugan, kahit milya-milyang agwat ang pagitan. Nagkakaisa sa indak katawitan niyo sa piano, tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. Tayo na't sumabay sa tugtugan, kahit milya-milyang agwat ang pagitan. Nagkakaisa sa indak katawitan niyo sa piano, tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. Saan mang sulok ng mundo tayo ay lilipad. Saan mang sulok ng mundo, yung sa piano tayo bigyang buhay ang ating mundo. Hey.
Our ever-loving Father, the core of every reason, the source of truth. You who made the earth and the heavens are the ultimate goal of every knowledge seekers, the infinite wisdom, the cause of all that is good. We are truly grateful for this opportunity to gather together as a community despite the challenges we face each day. Yet you remained and gave us strength to carry on the responsibilities of bearing intelligence and using them for better purposes. We now humbly ask you to join us in our endeavor to explore the wonders of life in the world for knowledge's sake, that in whatever we learn today, we become more grounded to you, who is truth, who is love. We pray that you bless our speakers, the fount of your infinite knowledge, that they can share something worthwhile despite the limited time we have. They can channel all they know and share to us the beauty and truth of living as your child. We pray that you guide our participants, the seekers of your boundless knowledge, that they may continue to persevere in the search and be deemed worthy to share what they learn from today's session. Sanctify us, O Lord, not because we are worthy of it, but because we believe in your love and mercy, that at the end of the day, we can take home something that's amazing and meaningful. This we ask and pray through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Hi, hello, global people. Welcome to the Global Talk. I am your host, Jemima Kija V. Bernido. And wow, what a wonderful afternoon we have today. I am so glad that all of you are here with us. This afternoon, the Global Talk will discuss on the structures of globalism. As a citizen, I believe that awareness on what's going on around the world and on the things that involve us is very much important, especially to our viewers and to our listeners as well who are studying or who are still in college right now. Topics like this is very helpful. At this point, I am sure that you are all as excited as I am to know more about the structures of globalism or globalization. And of course, to raise your answers or your questions rather, you can raise them during our open forum later on. So, for today's episode of the Global Talk, we have invited 3 great people to join us here this afternoon to discuss on the topics under the structures of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome our speakers for today. We are joined by the National Economic and Development Authority Chief herself. Let us all welcome Chief Kimberly Joyce Ali. We also have Dr. Aladil Jane Shannon Alejandrino, the President of the University of Southeastern Philippines. And of course, let us also welcome our very own Davao City Governor, Governor Anna Kim Bang. Welcome to the Global Talk, Chief Kim, Doc Aladil, and Gov Anna. It's really a great pleasure to have you all here and to be able to talk to you all. Thank you so much for, allotting your precious time to join us here today.
Thank you also for inviting us.
Yeah, actually, I will do anything for this webinar. I would be very much honored to share my knowledge about the mentioned topics, especially to the youth who are with us today.
Yeah, I am really happy to accept the invite and I'm excited for what our episode would bring.
Wow, that's really overwhelming to hear from all of you. And of course, thank you so much to Gov Anna because I think she is in abroad right now doing some um, seminar with the international leaders. So thank you so much, Gov, for really taking your allotting your time to be with us today. I know your schedule is very hectic right now. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
So,
I really love to be here actually. Thank you for inviting me too.
but I just want to know, how are you all doing? I mean, with the pandemic and with your jobs in your respective offices, I'm curious about, how it's like to lead people and attend to your responsibilities in this new normal. So how do you cope?
Yes, Miss Bernido, as the chief of NEGA, their responsibilities and duties are really overwhelming given that we are currently experiencing pandemic. So yesterday, October 13, 2021, our socioeconomic planning secretary, Carl Kendrick T. Chua, delivered a presentation about the proposed budget 2022 of the following: the National Economic and Development Authority and attached agencies on public hearing of the Committee on Finance, wherein we discussed about the piloting of the community-based monitoring system, and we've discussed the goals next year. And yeah, and as it was planned that we will conduct the national demographic and health survey, which is important especially in the pandemic, and our preparation for the census of agriculture and fisheries, which is done every 10 years. Yes, that sums it up.
Wow, I cannot imagine how challenging offices are right now in this time of pandemic. How about you, Doc Aladil? How are you doing?
For me, it is challenging as the president of University of Southeastern Philippines because we must really find time to prepare the institution for an unsettled future that looks very different from the old status quo, and not just for a short period of time. And as we continue to navigate and disrupt the disruptions and challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the faculty and staff are doing their very best in developing and implementing ways to support our students and help sustain their academic progress. So yeah.
Wow. As a president of a university, it's really hard to do the job at this time, but I commend the efforts of our leaders. How about you, Gov? The very busy governor of Davao. How are you coping
Yeah,
up?
yeah, I would really lie if I will tell that I wasn't struggling. Everyone is having a hard
Mhm.
time, especially during this pandemic. And I would say it's a lot harder on my end because you see, as a public servant, you can't be weak in front of these people.
Yeah, I
They,
agree.
you've been like a source of strength for them. So I have to be strong as a mother, as a wife, and as a public servant. I have no choice but to be strong. So yeah, though it's hard, there are still a lot of reasons to keep on fighting. Example is this webinar. Like, yeah, I was really busy and I'm really tired, I must admit, but I have to be here. It's not for me, it's not for you, but for everyone who is listening and for everyone who will be benefited of this webinar.
Wow, that's really a heartfelt message. I mean, as a Davaoenia, I really thank you, Gov, together with all our local leaders here in Davao City for the great effort. I know that you are all struggling. We are all struggling with our personal lives. But you know, yeah, what you said was very agreeable. That we have to cope. We have to stand up. We have to do our job and help other people. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that message. We really cannot deny the fact that everybody is struggling, as what you've said. And hearing those answers from all of you proves that no one is exempted, right? Speaking of pandemic and the new normal, Philippines is not only the country who have experienced, massive adjustments due to COVID-19. In fact, it's a global challenge. Many aspects of the society have been affected, including the global economic status, the markets, and even the global governance. With that being said, let me introduce to you the topics that we will be covering in today's session. Of course, through our speakers. We will discuss on the structures of globalization, which includes the global economy, market integration, and the global interstate and global governance. Also, before I forget, questions, insights, or clarifications will be entertained later on during the open forum, which is every after the speaker's discussion. So the attendees are encouraged to raise their questions, to share their insights. All right, without further ado, again, let us give a virtual round of applause for our first speaker who will talk about the global economy. The floor is yours, NEDA Chief Kimberly Joyce Allen.
Thank you for welcoming me for today's Global Talk, Ms. Jem. It is my honor and pleasure to accept your invitation. By the way, I am Kimberly Joyce Ali, Chief of NEDA, also known as National Economic and Development Authority. I will be the first speaker for today's webinar, and I will be talking about the global economy. The objectives for today's discussion is first, define economic globalization. Second, understand why nations trade with each other. Third, summarize the different theories explaining trade flows between nations. And lastly, identify the policy instruments used by governments to influence international trade flows. The workings of the invisible hand in today's borderless economy have reached a strength that Adam Smith, the father of economics, could never have imagined. Economic activity in Smith's day took place on a landscape largely defined and circumscribed by nation-state political borders. So, economic activity determines the terrain in which all other organizations, including political institutions, must function. Business and government are only now starting to recognize the effects. So this topic began with a definition of the term global economy. So the global economy is the result of the emergence of an economy that transcends national borders and allows free movement across nations. An economy that transcends borders or countries has openly questioned not only how much room governments have to operate, but also how much they can influence in the country's economic growth. When it comes to their own economy, states are emerging to envision themselves as having a less role. Although this economic restructuring of authority is symbolic in nature, it represents a loss of control not only in the economic arena but also in the social arena as the concept of globalization gains traction around the world. There are entire areas of economic policy that states may seek to act on this situation, but it is conclusively disproved for them to manage. A state remains a state and its governments remain in power of said state. However, The range of things the state has the capacity to control is greatly diminished, in part that diminishment can be seen as a diminishment of sovereignty. In this sense, while globalization has led to the convergence of more developed countries, many argue that the welfare gap between the more and less developed economies is growing. Global economics looks at how trade has shaped the global economy and considers the costs and benefits of free trade, and it also provides an analysis of the major problems facing the global economy in the 21st century and provides an analysis of the financial crisis and the rise of powerful trading blocs. So, why do countries trade? Countries trade with each other when, on their own, they do not have the resources or capacity to satisfy their own needs and wants. By developing and exploiting their domestic scarce resources, countries can produce a surplus and trade this for the resources they need. Goods and services are likely to be imported from abroad for several reasons, and imports may be cheaper or of better quality. They may also be more easily available or simply more appealing than locally produced goods. In many instances, no local alternatives exist, and importing is essential. This is highlighted today in the case of Japan, which has no oil reserves of its own, yet it is the world's fourth larger consumer of oil and must import all it requires. The production of goods and services in countries that need to trade is based on two fundamental principles by Adam Smith in the 18th century, this being the division of labor and specialization. In its strictest sense, a division of labor means breaking down production into small, interconnected tasks, and then allocating these tasks to different workers based on their suitability to undertake the task efficiently. And when applied internationally, a division of labor means that countries produce just a small range of goods or services and may contribute only a small part to finished products sold in global markets. So say for example, a bar of chocolate is likely to contain many ingredients from numerous countries, with each country contributing perhaps just one ingredient to the final product. On the other hand, specialization is the second fundamental principle associated with trade and results from the division of labor. So given that each worker or each producer is given a specialist role, they are likely to become efficient contributors to the overall process of production and to the finished product. Hence, specialization can generate further benefits in terms of efficiency and productivity. Specialization can be applied to individuals, firms, machinery, and technology, and to the whole countries. International specialization is increased when countries use their scarce resources to produce just a small range of products in high volume. Mass production allows a surplus of goods to be produced, which can then be exported. This means that goods and resources must be imported from other countries that have also specialized and produced surpluses of their own. Countries specialize in producing commodities where they have an advantage in production over other countries. How do we know which commodities countries will specialize on? In principle of absolute advantage, suppose there are two countries, A and B, producing only two commodities, potatoes and clothes. Let us assume that given the raw materials, the productivity of labor in producing potatoes and clothes determines the quantity of commodities actually produced. How will trade occur? In general, trade between two countries will likely take place. Country A can produce one good more efficiently than country B, and country B can produce the other good more efficiently than country A. So consider table 2.1. Country A can produce 6 sacks of potatoes for every worker it employs in one day. On the other hand, it can produce 4 pieces of clothes per day if that worker was employed in the clothes industry. Looking at country B, we see that each of its workers can produce 3 sacks of potatoes or 12 pieces of clothes per day. It is obvious that country A is more efficient in producing potatoes than country B since it can produce more sacks of potatoes for every worker it employs than country B can. Country B is more efficient in the production of clothes than country A since it can produce more pieces of clothes for every worker it hires than country A can. We see from example that country A has an absolute advantage over country B in the production of potatoes, and country B has an absolute advantage over country A in the production of clothes. We can say that a country has absolute advantage in one commodity over another country if that country can produce the commodity more efficiently than the other country can. If the two countries are allowed to trade, countries A and B will specialize in producing commodities that each can produce more efficiently relative to the other country. Why? Suppose that each country is endowed with units of labor. Countries A and B have the option of either specializing in one commodity or dividing their labor resources for the production of both potatoes and clothes. Let us examine the case where the countries are not allowed to trade. This means that both commodities to satisfy domestic demand. To make things simple, let us assume that preferences are such that labor is divided equally between two industries in each country. Table 2.2 shows the production schedules of countries A and B for potatoes and clothes. In a situation without trade, the amount of potatoes available for country A is 30, while the amount of clothes available is 20. For country B, available potatoes are 15 sacks and clothes produced is 60 pieces. Now, suppose that the countries are allowed to trade and each country specializes in the commodity where it is relatively more efficient in production. Country A therefore will specialize in the production of potatoes and country B will specialize in production of clothes. Table 2.3 shows the resulting production schedule with specialization in trade. Notice from table 2.3 that potato production for country A doubles from 30 to 60 sacks with the reallocation of labor from clothes to potato production. For country B, the production of clothes also doubles from 60 to 120 pieces. Suppose that the countries trade with each other with the assumption that one piece of cloth exchanges for one sack of potatoes. Will both countries be better off? If country A exports the additional sacks of potatoes it produces, 30 sacks, and exchange them for clothes, then more clothes would be available for the domestic market of country A. The same thing will be true for country B. Specialization and trade expand production and consumer choices because more commodities become available. On the other hand, in Principle of Comparative Advantage, David Ricardo took Adam Smith's theory one step further by exploring what might happen when one country has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods. Smith's theory of absolute advantage suggests that such country might derive no benefits from international trade. So according to Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, it makes no sense for a country to specialize in the production in those goods that it produces most efficiently and to buy the goods that it produces less efficiently from other countries, even if this means buying goods from other countries that it could produce more efficiently itself. We have structured the situation in such a way that one country would have absolute advantage in one commodity and the other country will have absolute advantage on the other commodity. What if one country has absolute advantage in both commodities? Would trade and specialization still occur? Obviously, a country like the United States that has absolute advantage over the Philippines in almost all commodities. But why is it that trading still occurs? Let us take the case of two countries, C and D, with rice and shoes as the commodities. Table 2.4 shows the productivity of 1 unit of labor per day. According to Table 2.4, in country C, a worker can produce 12 sacks of rice or 6 pairs of shoes for a day's work. In country D, one worker can produce 2 sacks of rice or 4 pairs of shoes. Thus, country C can produce both commodities more efficiently relative to country D. Clearly, we can see that country C has absolute advantage in producing rice and shoes because it can produce more of both commodities per unit of labor than country D. Would there be benefits accruing to both countries if they were to trade? What would be their basis of trading? Note that a worker in country C can produce 6 times as many sacks of rice as a worker in country D. However, country C can only produce 1.5 times more pairs of shoes. Country C is more efficient in producing rice than shoes, while country D is more efficient in the production of shoes relative to the production of rice. Country C has a comparative advantage in the production of rice, while country D has a comparative advantage in the production of shoes. To further illustrate the concept of a comparative advantage, let us look at the opportunity costs for each country in producing two commodities. To produce 6 more pairs of shoes, country C has to give up producing 12 sacks of rice. Thus, the opportunity cost of producing 1 pair of shoes, country C, is 2 sacks of rice. And country D, to be able to produce 4 additional pairs of shoes, it must sacrifice producing 2 sacks of rice. In other words, the opportunity cost in producing 1 more pair of shoes is only 1/2 sack of rice. Country D has lower opportunity cost in producing shoes than country C. Hence, country D has comparative advantage over country C in the production of shoes. We say that a country has comparative advantage in the production of a commodity if that country can produce that commodity more efficiently or at a lower opportunity cost than another commodity relative to another country. Each country will specialize in the production of a commodity where it has comparative, not absolute advantage. Country C will specialize in the production of shoes. The basis, therefore, for specialization and trade in general is comparative advantage and not absolute advantage. Absolute advantage could only be used as a basis in special cases like one we had earlier. Thus, countries specialize in and export those goods and services where they have comparative advantage and import those commodities where they do not have comparative advantage. This is the law of comparative advantage. The advantages of trade. International trade brings a number of valuable benefits to a country, including the exploitation of a country's comparative advantage, which means that trade encourages a country to specialize in producing only those goods and services which it can produce more effectively and efficiently and at the lower opportunity cost. Second, producing a narrow range of goods and services for the domestic and export market means that a country can produce in at a higher volumes which provides further cost benefits in terms of economies of scales. Trade increases competition and lowers world prices, which provides benefits to consumers by raising the purchasing power of their own income and leads a rise in consumer surplus. Next, trade also breaks down domestic monopolies which face competition from more efficient foreign firms. Next, the quality of goods and services is likely to increase as competition encourages innovation, design, and the application of new technologies. Trade will also encourage the transfer of technology between countries. And lastly, trade is also likely to increase employment given that employment is closely related to production. Trade means that more will be employed in the export sector, and through the multiplier process, more jobs will be created across the whole economy. Advantages of trade. Despite the benefits, trade can also bring some disadvantages, including trade can lead to over-specialization, with workers at risk of losing their jobs when goods for domestic consumption can be produced more cheaply abroad. Jobs lost through such changes because of severe structural unemployment. Next, certain industries do not get a chance to grow because they face competition from more established foreign firms, such as new infant industries, which may find it difficult to establish themselves. And lastly, local producers who may supply a unique product tailored to meet the needs of the domestic market may suffer because the cheaper imports may destroy their market. Over time, the diversity of output in an economy may diminish as local producers leave the market. Trade versus protectionism. One view says that we should make it as easy as possible for goods and services to move between countries. This approach is based on the argument that more trade makes us wealthier and is therefore a good thing. It is known as free trade. Another approach says that we should restrict trade, and we might do this to protect certain jobs. We might think that we need certain industries such as food production or steel making just in case things go wrong in the wider world. We might want to restrict imports from countries with lower labor or environmental standards so they can't undercut our industries. And this approach is known as protectionism. Many economists agree that some restrictions on trade are desirable, but that we should be careful, as such restrictions can make us poorer overall. For example, limits on agricultural imports may be good for British farmers, but they also increase food prices. Arguments for free trade. The following sections set out some of the arguments in more detail. There are several key arguments in favor of free trade. So free trade increases the size of the economy as a whole, and it allows goods and services to produce more efficiently, and that's because it encourages goods or services to be produced where natural resources, infrastructure, or skills and expertise are best suited to them. It increases productivity, which can lead to higher wages in the long term. There is widespread agreement that rising global trade in recent decades has increased economic growth. Free trade is good for consumers. It reduces prices by eliminating tariffs and increasing competition. Greater competition is also likely to improve quality and choice. Some things, such as tropical fruit, would not be available in the UK without trade. Reducing non-tariff barriers can remove red tape, thus reducing the cost of trading, and if companies that trade in several countries have to work with only one set of regulations, their costs of compliance come down, and in principle, this will make goods and services cheaper. Lastly, in contrast, protectionism can result in destructive trade wars that increase costs and uncertainty as each side attempts to protect its own economy. Protectionist rules can tend to favor big businesses and vested interests as they have the resources to lobby most effectively. While free trade increases the size of the economy as a whole, it isn't always good for everyone. Arguments for protectionism are: as more countries experience industrial development, traditional domestic industries can decline. In the UK, for example, the shipbuilding industry has declined in the face of international competition since the 1950s, and currently steel production faces increasing competition. Protectionism can help preserve jobs in these sectors or at least slow the process of change. Next, protectionism can also build new industries in sectors with high startup costs. New firms might find it difficult to compete if there is not support government in the form of tariffs or subsidies. Once they have become competitive, such barriers can be removed. Protectionism can be used to safeguard strategic industries such as energy, water, steel, and food. For example, food security may be seen as important so that we can feed ourselves if something terrible happens to disrupt the system of world trade. Some people worry that free trade deals can lead to a lowering of standards. Such deals might require us to let in goods and services even though they don't meet our standards, which might then be cheaper than those domestic industries. There might also be pressure to reduce our standards for workers' rights or environmental protection so that our companies can compete with companies in countries that have lower standards. So that would be all. Thank you for listening.
Wow, that was a very informative talk. Now, Chief and Chief Kimberly, will it be okay if we entertain questions from our attendees?
Yes, please, that would be great.
All right. So, for our attendees here in the webinar, does anyone have a question about the topic, which is on the global economy? If you have, kindly virtually raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button here in the screen on the screen. I am encouraging our attendees to ask their questions because it's not every day that we get to talk with the NEDA chief. Oh yes, thank you so much, Jasper, June, and Doy. Kindly open your mic, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for acknowledging me. Um, I really got the point of the session, about trade and everything. But I just want to ask if is there any opportunity or you know threat to workers, and if does trade create or destroy jobs? Well,
Okay, thank you for that question, Mr. Jasper. So, to answer that, trade can lead to over specialization, putting employees at danger of losing their jobs if global demand falls or if domestic goods can be produced more cheaply elsewhere. Such changes can result in the loss of jobs, resulting in severe structural unemployment. Did I answer your question?
yes, yes, po. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper. Thank you so much to our NEDA chief, Kimberly Joyce Ali, for the comprehensive discussion. And later on, we will get back to you, ma'am, later on. So, before we proceed to the next speaker, I know you're all excited to hear another discussion. But before that, let us first be entertained by a song number prepared to us by the one and only R&B superstar, Jasper. Let's give him a virtual clap.
Tell me her name, I want to know the way she looks and where you go. I need to see her face, I need to understand why you and I came to an end. Tell me again, I want to hear what broke my faith in all these years. Who lays with you at night while I'm here all alone, remembering when I was young. I let you go, I let you fly. Why do I keep on asking why? I let you go now that I found a way to keep somehow more than a broken vow. Tell me the words I never said. Show me the tears you never shed. Give me the touch that one you promised to be mine. Or has it vanished for all time? I let you go, I let you fly. Why do I keep on asking why? I let you go now that I found a way to keep somehow more than a broken vow. I close my eyes and dream of you and I, and then I realize there's more to love than only bitterness and lies. I close my eyes. I'd give away my soul to hold you once again, and never let this promise end. I let you go, I let you fly. Now that I know, I'm asking why. I let you go now that I found a way to keep somehow more than a broken vow.
Wow, what a wonderful voice! Thank you so much, Jasper, for the sweet surprise. We are so touched by your voice. Bugno kay tingog si Jasper, guys. Don't worry, because we will see him and we will hear more of him later on. Now, let's proceed to another topic to discuss about market integration. Let us give a virtual round of applause for our second speaker, Dr. Aladil Jane Shannon Alejandrino.
Good day, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me here, and I am very excited to have a discussion with you. So, right now, I am going to talk about market integration. When we say market integration, it is a term that is used to identify a phenomenon in which markets of goods and services that are somehow related to one another being to experience similar patterns of increase or decrease in terms of the prices of those products. The term can also refer to a situation in which the prices of related goods and services sold in a defined geographical location also begin to move in some sort of similar pattern to one another. So at times, the integration may be intentional with the government implementing certain strategies as a way to control the direction of the economy. At other times, the integrating of the markets may be due to factors such as shifts in supply and demand that have a spillover effect on several markets. So when a market integration exists rather, the events occurring within two or more markets are exerting effects that also prompt similar changes or shifts in other markets that focus on related goods. For example, if the demand for baby doll um, within a given geographical market were to suddenly be reduced by 50%, there is a good chance that the demand for baby doll clothing would also decrease in proportion within that the same geographical market. So if the baby market increased, this would also usually mean that the market for doll clothing would also increase. Both markets would have the chance to adjust pricing in order to deal with the new circumstances surrounding the demand as well as adjust other factors such as production. So the social institution that has one of the biggest impacts in society is the economy. You might think of the economy in terms of number of unemployed or the gross domestic product or whatever the stock market is doing today. While we often talk about it in numerical terms, the economy is composed of people. It is a social institution that organizes all production, consumption, and trade of goods in the society. There are many ways in which products can be made, exchanged, and used. Think about capitalism or socialism. These economic systems and economic revolutions that created then shape the way people live their lives. So economic systems vary from one society to another, but in any given economy, production typically splits into three sectors. So the first one is the primary sector, which extracts raw materials from natural environments. So workers like farmers or miners fit in the primary sector. The secondary sector gains the raw materials and transforms them into manufactured goods. This means, for example, that um, someone from the primary sectors extracts oil from the earth, then someone from the secondary sector refines the petroleum to gasoline. Whereas the tertiary sector involves services rather than goods. It offers services by doing things rather than making things. Thus, economic system is more sophisticated, or at least more sophisticated than the way things used to be for much of human history. So this time I will be talking about the contributions of the different financial and economic institutions that facilitated the growth of the global economy. The history of the global market will be discussed by looking at the different economic revolutions, the growth and dynamics of multinational corporations that are emerging for today's world economy will also be examined. So the post-World War II economic system and the role of international financial institutions in the creation of a global economy. In July 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference, formerly known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, marked the birth of a new international economic framework which have delegates from 44 countries convened in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and United States. They agreed on the creation of two international economic organizations, such as the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and World Bank of or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So these institutions are known as the Bretton Woods institutions, which were known Keystone International Economic Organizations or the KIEO due to their central role in trade, development, and monetary relations. In July 1945, Congress passed the Bretton Woods Agreement Act authorizing U.S. entry into the IMF and IBRD. So the two organizations officially came into existence in December 27, 1945. And in 1947, it is the birth of General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, or the GATT. This much more informal institution than the IMF and the World Bank serve as the primary global trade organization. So the post-war institutional framework was created to address the problems that occurred during the interwar period, trade protectionism and exchange controls which led to the Great Depression and the World War II. So the functions of this institution will be discussed in detail, as well as how the roles have changed in the contemporary period. So the first one is the International Monetary Fund. The primary purpose of the IMF is to promote global monetary cooperation and international financial stability. This was designed to monitor the system of pegged or fixed exchange rates of currencies that were related to gold and US dollar. It was designed to prevent the trade wars that occurred during the interwar period because of its competitive devaluations of sales of their currency. So this institution was designed for the mandate of ensuring international financial cooperation and reinforces international trade. So when states suffer from balance of payments deficits, they reduce the value of their currencies to boost exports with cheaper products and decrease imports. A balance of payment deficit occurs when a country spends more than it takes in, and this is the time that the IMF is to provide short-term loans to prevent devaluation and retain the state's fixed exchange rate. In instances of the temporary balance of payment deficit, but the IMF's role changed when the fixed exchange rate system collapsed and was replaced by floating exchange rate in 1971. It still had the role of providing liquidity, but has more focus on countries tied to major currencies instead of countries supplying them. So the IMF is an institution based on quotas which determine the maximum amount of financial resources that a state is obliged to provide to the fund. The quota of states reflects their relative positions in the global economy and determines the voting power of states in IMF decisions. So since the IMF has been dominated by the Western countries and has been much criticized for marginalizing the South, this resulted to failing in emerging economies and its decision making. So the global financial crisis event 2009 has prompted the IMF to undergo a reform process consisting of two elements. The first one is IMF resource expansion to enhance capacity for financial crisis management, and the second one is to increase in quota and voting power of emerging economies within the institution. So the 2010 reform structure package involved doubling of the IMF quota, shifting of quota shares, and preserved quota and voting shares of poorest member states. So the reform shifted more than 6% from overrepresented to underrepresented member countries and to developing and dynamic emerging markets and reshuffling fields of the executive board to both restore the institution legitimacy and crisis management capacity. So according to Lisagi et al., explains that the outcome of the reform negotiations as a trade-off between money and power. It was an agreement particularly between the BRIC grouping among the Brazil, Russia, India, and China to contribute to the fund's resources in exchange to quota and governance reforms about the redistribution of the quota and executive broad seats from the West to the South. So the 2010 reform, however, has not led to the long expected reform and strengthening to the IMF. So the next one is the International Bank for Reconstruction and the Development, or the World Bank. So the role of International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was created to grant long-term loans for the economic development or less developed countries and the reconstruction of war-torn countries. So in Europe, the World Bank today is made up of two institutions. One is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which provides international development association which grants credit and loans to lowest income countries. So the World Bank is only a component of the World Bank Group, which is comprised of three other institutions. The first one is the International Finance Corporation that provides financing of private enterprise investment in developing countries around of the world through both loans and direct investment. The second one is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency that promotes investment in developing countries by offering political and economic risk insurance. And the last one is the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes that provides for settlement of disputes by conciliation, arbitration, that is continually secondary importance. So the countries that in which policy influence is grounded on the legitimacy and credibility enhanced by its commitment to reducing poverty, along with its um, technocratic staff and its status as a multilateral organization. So, contrary to the bank's supposed normative commitment, the bank's impact on growth outcomes has been contested. So, Easterly finds severe macroeconomic distortion suffered by loan recipients and no statistical evidence of per capita, improving from increased structural adjustment lending. So more than that, the programs have been accused of worsening the state of poverty and underdevelopment of recipient countries. According to Chandra et al., which they find empirical evidence that the bank's structural adjustment resulted in adverse effects on children in sub-Saharan Africa. So furthermore, there are also other international financial institutions such as IMF and the African Development Bank have detrimental effects on child and maternal health in the developing world. So such policy reforms significantly undermine access to health care and adversely impact on income and food availability, which are social detriments of health. So do you get it? So let's proceed now to the differences between GATT, which means General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and WTO, or World Trade Organization rather. So the purpose of the GATT was to avoid trade wars by raising protectionist barriers as witnessed during the interwar period. So, excuse me. So GATT was created years after the Bretton Woods due to the refusal of the US to sign the Havana Charter that would create an international trade organization at par with that of the IMF and GATT. So the agricultural sector in the US feared for losses that may be brought by the ITO and pressures in the US Congress resulted to the failure of reaching an agreement, thus resulting to the informal GATT. So states who took part in the GATT were contracting parties instead of formal members due to the nature of the agreement as a provisional treaty. So while it was effective in liberalizing trade, GATT was unable to address the expansion of trade in services, investment, and intellectual property. It was also incapable of providing a strong and efficient system for dispute settlement. That was eventually superseded by a more formal World Trade Organization in 1995 that managed to address these issues. The objective of WTO is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and smoothly as possible. So, also to lower trade barriers between nations and its people is one of their objectives. The purpose is to help producers of goods and services, exporters, importers, and conduct their business. So this time you can see here the more detailed information about the differences of GATT and WTO. So let's proceed now to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or the OPEC, and the European Union, or the EU. So Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, is the most encompassing club to the richest countries in the world, with 35 member states as of 2016, with Latvia as its latest member. So it is highly influential despite the group having little formal power. So this emanates from the member countries' resources and economic power. In 1960, the OPEC was originally comprised of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, and Venezuela. So the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed because member countries wanted to increase the price of oil, which in the past had a relatively low price and had failed in keeping up with inflation. So today, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Libya, Qatar, Nigeria, and Indonesia were also included as members. And lastly is the European Union. It is made up of 28 member states. Most members in the Eurozone adopted the euro as basic currency, but some Western European nations like the Great Britain, Sweden, and Denmark did not. So critics agree that the euro increased the prices in Eurozones and resulted in depressed economic growth rates like in Greece, Spain, and Portugal. So the policies of the European Central Bank are considered to be a significant contributor in this situation. So next is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the NAFTA. The NAFTA is a trade pact between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, created on January 1, 1994, when Mexico joined the two other nations. It was first created in 1989 with only Canada and the United States as trading partners. NAFTA helps in developing and expanding world trade by broadening international cooperation. So it also aims to increase cooperation for improving working conditions in North America by reducing barriers to trade as it expands the markets of the three countries. So the creation of NAFTA has caused manufacturing jobs from developed nations, which are the Canada or the United States, to transfer to less developed nations, which is Mexico, in order to reduce the cost of their products. For example, in Mexico, producer prices dropped and some 2 million farmers were forced to leave their farms. So during this time, consumer food prices rose, causing 20 million Mexicans, which is about 25% of their population, to live in food poverty. So within this, one can argue that NAFTA was to blame for job losses and wage stagnation in the United States because competition from Mexican firms had forced many U.S. firms to relocate to Mexico because of outsourcing. When we say outsourcing, it is having less government regulations and cheaper labor in developing nations. So, as an example of outsourcing, the United States outsourced approximately of 791,000 jobs to Mexico in 2010. And as for Canada, 76% of Canadian exports to go to the United States, and a quarter of the jobs in Canada are dependent in some way on the trade with the United States. So this means that if NAFTA changes or is eradicated, it would be devastating for Canada's economy. So generally, NAFTA has its positive and negative consequences. It lowered prices by removing tariffs, opened up new opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses to establish a name for itself, quadrupled trade between three countries, and created 5 million US jobs. So some of the negative effects of NAFTA include excessive pollution, loss of more than 682,000 manufacturing jobs, exploitation of workers in Mexico, and moving Mexican farmers out of business. So let's proceed now to the international monetary system. So this system is defined as a set of general rules, um, legal in foreign trade, legal in foreign trade, and it is brought by the multilateral international agreements of trading participants, facilitated by international financial organizations. So the gold standard, meaning a monetary system where a country's currency or paper money has a value directly linked to gold, was adopted by England in 1816. So being the first country to industrialize was the first international monetary system. So it would later joined by European countries and the United States. It functioned as a fixed exchange rate regime where countries determined the gold content of their national currencies, which would define the fixed exchange rate. So the system maintained the equilibrium of the trade balance automatically. The deficit in balance of payments due to gold reserve outflows would result in the fewer money supply in the domestic market, causing a decline in domestic prices. This is also a beneficial to exporting cheaper goods but not on imports of higher priced goods, which then contribute to the balance. So this can be detailed by financial policies of raising interest rates to promote capital inflow and to maintain the gold reserves at a fixed level. So reversing the downward pressures on the prices of influencing demands for imports and exports. So the gold standard was also non-inflationary because the issuance of money is dependent on a state's gold resources. So price fluctuations would occur due to gold outflows or discovery of gold mines. So however, these also served as the primary weaknesses of the fixed exchange rate system as it is limited cash flow and curb economic development. So the new international monetary system was named the gold bullion standard, wherein it was established during the World War I that marked the dissolution of the classical gold standard and the shift to paper money that is not tied to gold reserves and whose exchange rate was determined by the supply and demand in the foreign exchange market. And it is an attempt to return to modify the gold started that was held in a 1922 conference in Genoa. So the gold bullion standard banknotes were exchangeable for gold bullion of fixed weight, therefore involving only the exchange of large sums of money. So the system failed to facilitate the free convertibility of currencies to gold, and it collapsed in 1931 with the outbreak of Great Depression in the 1930s. So the first symptoms of the economic crisis were the Great Crash or the Wall Street crash of 1929, of stock market crisis which delivered a wave bankruptcies, a decrease in trade and production, and unemployment in the United States, also hitting hard cities around the world. So, the period of the 1930s interwar period would increase intensity beggar by neighbor policies, trade protectionism, competitive devaluation, rigid capital controls among states, and this harsh impact of these policies to the society steered economic policy towards state interventionism with primary objectives of increasing employment, income, and production based on Keynesian principles of state intervention. So in the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, 44 countries agreed in creating a new international system that would prevent the chaos that occurred during the interwar period. So this was called the Bretton Woods system that was established an adjustable peg system that is also known as the dollar gold standard or gold exchange standard with the US dollar as the only convertible currency that is considered to be as good as gold. So as the emerging hegemon, and when we say hegemon, it is having dominant influence or authority over others. So US committed itself to purchase and sell gold as at 35 US dollar an ounce without restrictions, while other currencies in turn were fixed to the dollars. So as the world leader sustaining the new regime, US managed to maintain its balance of payment surplus. So with the restoration and emergence of the economic powers in Europe and Japan, so this would gradually face persistent deficits, which were an inevitable consequence of serving as the world's reserve currency. So the stability of operations of the Bretton Woods system was conceived to have only lasted from 1959 to 1968. So the collapse of the system was contributed by the growth of private and official liquid dollar claims of foreigners, reduction in official gold holdings, especially that of the US, and precedent balance of payments problems of the US. So the problems of the Bretton Woods system would be exposed in the 1960s when the United States began to suffer from its balance of payments deficit. So it was difficult to maintain the stable price of gold, maintaining the fixed gold price in the face of constant price increase globally resulted in its reduction of production. So, international reserve of gold had stagnant growth due to low official price, while most of the growth was seen in foreign-owned US dollars, which is the growth encountered problems due to deficits, and states started losing confidence in the strength of the dollar and began purchasing gold reserves from the US. In the 1960s and the 1970s, a series of changes were introduced to maintain the operations of the Bretton Woods system and to resolve its deficiencies. The series of interventions involved solutions such as the formation gold pool and the special drawing rights to expand resources and means for payment. However, these changes were insufficient in the face of worsening U.S. deficit, currency speculation, and inflation. The problems would eventually result to U.S. abandonment of the gold exchange standard and the eventual collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973, forcing states to fluctuate their exchange rates to be determined by market forces, and succeeding attempts to return to a regulated exchange rate system would be pursued but to no avail. So with a shift from a pegged system to a floating one, IMF allows flexibility among member states to determine their exchange rates or tie them to major currencies such as the dollar or the SDR. So the IMF also allows a managed float system where central banks are allowed to intervene to address the fluctuations in the exchange rate by buying and selling currencies. However, countries are not allowed to manipulate their currencies to achieve short-term gains at the expense of other economies. So right now, let's proceed with the history of market integration from a unilateral to a multilateral trade order. International trade was marked with colonial expansionism and surplus accumulation of gold stocks in the balance of payments, which boosted exports and curtailed imports. So this period was situated in zero-sum game in economic relations, the pursuit of beggar thy neighbor policies which led to trade wars. So industrialization in the 19th century advanced trade liberalization under the leadership of the United Kingdom, which is the first country to industrialize and the hegemon, particularly in 1846 during the repeal of the British Home Law. So not all states, however, embraced free trade during the era of industrialization. The United States, together with Germany, initially pursued import substitution, industrialization, imposing tariffs on manufactured goods to protect their infant industries. So the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1932 addressed the decline in international trade by transferring authority to decide on trade matters the U.S. President, freeing the Congress from pressure coming from protectionist interests. So since during the outbreak of World War I resulted to the overturning of the free trade regime and the return of protectionism. So other states would respond through a cycle of retaliation, severely reducing the extent and amount of trade among countries. The post-World War II trade regime was established in the backdrop of what Ruge calls as embedded liberal compromise, an offshoot of Keynesianism economics where the promotion of an open global economy was accompanied by the government safeguards that would protect the domestic economy and social policies. So this trade regime was unique because it was informal and constituted by multilateral trade agreements. So negotiations are guided by the following principles such as trade liberalization via tariff reductions, non-discrimination, reciprocity, safeguards, and development. The development of these principles, however, has not been sufficiently prioritized by major trading powers. So GATT was unable to fully impose the limitations of free trade in exceptional cases concerning essential policies, objects such as health and public moral grounds, which ought to trump over the market goals. And other criticisms pertain to the inadequate the dispute settlement mechanisms of the institution. So the next bullet was GATT was successful in substantively reducing tariffs. These were eventually replaced with non-tariff barriers in forms such as environmental regulations and health and safety requirements, constituting new challenges and limitations to global trade. So the creation of the WTO was a legitimate multilateral institution with formal legal status as an international organization and formal diplomatic status for its secretariat, was a development form in the informal club of Western trading nations in GATT. So detailed rules extensively covered not only goods but also intellectual property, investment, and services. So WTO also become one of the most legalized international institutions in the world with its blinding and automatic dispute settlement mechanism. So the developing states, however, were disillusioned by the outcomes of the Uruguay round where less developed countries were perceived to have given up more than the inclusion of services, trade, and intellectual property than what they have reaped from limited agreements for textile and agriculture. The Uruguay round would then proceed to the Doha round, dubbed as the development round, which was unable to produce successful agreements. So the increasing membership of the organization made it more difficult to reach consensus and countries were not willing to make significant concessions to avoid a failure of the negotiation. The opposing positions of parties also led to its damage. Demands of developing countries to fully implement the Uruguay Agreement, particularly in the agricultural sector, and the demands of the US and EU, focusing on matters such as labor, environment, and investment concerns, became irreconcilable matters. So right now, let's proceed to from Keynesian to neoliberalism. During the Great Depression in 1930s, the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, a prominent British economist, have been influential in shaping the economic policy of developed countries. In his seminal work entitled The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, Keynes argued that market-generated equilibrium results in unemployment, which causes a decrease in demand. This, in return, is related to the decrease in investment and production. So he sees government spending as a solution to revive the economy by bolstering aggregate demand through fiscal and monetary policies. So the Keynes liberal interventionism approach influenced states to invest in big governments and shape the post-war global economic order that is grounded on the Keynesian compromise in of promoting open markets without undermining the protection of the society and the domestic market. So this allowed exceptions to be accepted in the form of capital controls and domestic trade protection. The Keynesian paradigm, however, would be challenged during the economic crisis of stagflation, or which means a combination of rising unemployment and inflation that occurred in the 1970s. So this would mark the entry of resurgence of liberalism through neoliberalism on a global scale due to the technological advancement that allowed the free flow of capital and goods across the globe. Grounded in the ideas of Friedrich and Hayek and Milton Friedman, the neoliberal solution was to have an unregulated market with as little state intervention as possible. It involved having the market take over tasks and services that ought to be provided by the government. So the key neoliberal policies were compromised of privatization, deregulation, lesser public spending, and reduced corporate taxes. The economic paradigm would expand through British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan, who popularized the policies and ideas dubbed as Thatcherism and Reaganism, which would then be followed by the emerging economists of East and Southeast Asia. So the United States and Great Britain, together with the industrialized nations, would promote globalization and integration into the global economy with the promise that capitalism would lead to economic prosperity alongside democratization. So within this, the IMF and the World Bank also aligned their policies to neoliberalism through the Washington Consensus, which is a set of 10 economic policy prescriptions for the recovering and crisis-ridden countries implemented by Washington-based institutions, which is the IMF, WB, and the US Treasury. So the term was coined by John Williamson, in which constituted the following principles. The first one is fiscal discipline. The second is reordering public expenditure priorities, tax reform, liberalizing interest rates, a competitive exchange rate, trade liberalization. The seventh one is liberalization of inward foreign direct investment. Next is privatization, deregulation, and lastly is the property rights. So these policies were applied through the Structural Adjustment Programs, or the SAP, of the IMF and the WB that imposed conditionally clauses attached to loans which have been criticized as were its adverse effects on developing nations. The Zapatista movement. So, the Zapatista movement in Mexico against the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Battle of Shadow during the WTO Ministerial Conference in the 1990s were the prominent transnational movements and the force sought to challenge against the global capitalism and neoliberal globalization. Offshoots of these movements would emerge in the 21st century with the Spanish Indagnos movement and the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement. So, such movements are a part of the broader collective resistance known as the global justice movement, which fights against inequality and the concentration of wealth among the wealthy minority. So these movements have yet to produce strong enough pressure to these international institutions. However, the global civil society continues to persistently and relentlessly expose the ills of today's global economic system. So all in all, market integration can often be a very positive situation, especially if the emerging pattern regarding pricing is indicative of an increasingly prosperous economy. So at the same time, assessing integration between markets can also be a useful tool in identifying trends that are less than desirable and having the chance to begin reversing those trends while there is still time. So for this reason, financial analysts as well as economists will often monitor activity in related markets, identify any signs of immigration, and make recommendations on what strategies could be used to make the most of the emerging situations. So that's all for my topic. Thank you for listening and for your cooperation, even though you know my topic is lengthy. So again, thank you very much and God bless us all.
Thank you so much, Doc Aladil. Now let us proceed immediately to the open forum. Any questions, reactions, clarifications, or insights to share from our attendees, reactors? You can now raise your hand if you have. You are all encouraged to speak. Yes, Miss Aileen.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our USEP President, Ms. Alejandrino. The one thing that I remembered from your topic, and it is for me, I think is the most one of the important things is the difference between the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is GATT, and the World Trade Organization or WTO. I think their difference is very good. Is important to explain. And one of my first question is: are multicultural or multi-ethnic society more positive about globalization than monocultural or mono-ethnic society?
Thank you for that question, Ms. Andequesto. So, diversity and multiculturalism are thought to enrich societies and broaden horizons. However, with an increase in immigration and geopolitical upheaval, many societies are feeling threatened by the changes in their communities. The fears are reflected in the emergence of stronger right-wing parties as well as in Brexit and new anti-immigration policies in the United States. So, did I answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miss Aileen. I believe we don't have any more questions. So again, thank you so much also to Doc Aladil for the very comprehensive discussion and also for answering our attendees' questions. Thank you so much for that. Once again, I know you're all excited for this. To serenade us with a song, let us welcome again on the virtual stage the superstar himself, Jasper.
is life to offer me when I grow old? What's there to look forward to beyond the biting cold? They say it's difficult, yes, stereotypical. What's there beyond sleepy to work, this cruel life? Ain't there nothing else around here but human strife? 'Cause they say it's difficult, yes, stereotypical. You gotta be conventional, you can't be so radical. So I sing this song to all of my age, for these are the questions we've got to face. For in this cycle that we call life, we are the ones who are next in line. We are next in line. What is life to offer me when I grow old? What's there to look forward to beyond the biting cold? 'Cause they say it's difficult, yes, stereotypical. You gotta be conventional, you can't be so radical. So I sing this song to all of my age, for these are the questions we've got to face. For in this cycle that we call life, we are the ones who are next in line. We are next in line. We gotta work, we gotta feel. Let's open our eyes and do whatever it takes. We gotta work, we gotta feel. Let's open our eyes. Oh, I sing this song to all of my age, for these are the questions we've got to face. For in this cycle that we call life, we are the ones who are next in line.
Thank you so much, Jasper. You never fail to amaze us with that voice of yours. Thank you, you're the best. Now, let's move on right away to our last topic. We are already on the last topic to discuss about the global, interstate, and global governance. Let us give a virtual round of applause for our third speaker, Governor Anna Kim Bangvir.
Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. Now, before we start, let me ask you a question. Imagine a world without any lawbreakers, because there is no law to break at all. I can't imagine, I cannot visualize how chaotic it would be. But what are rules for? We all know that each and every country in the world has a set of constitutional laws that punish those who have done unacceptable actions, especially to those that compromise others. It may be a human, environment, or animals. The major purposes of rules and laws are safety, security, and organization. With these three, everything else follows. Sadly, the global system is anarchic, that there were no set of rules imposed, and we all know that it is the rules and regulations that maintain international peace and security. Now, what is anarchy? Anarchy is a state of lawlessness or political disorder due to the absence of governmental authority. In a world where there is anarchy, where no overpowering state-like entity imposes rules and order, it is imperative that the nation-state impose its sovereign power within its domain. Since it's anarchic, this necessitates the global governance to maintain international peace and security. Now, what is global governance? Global governance is defined as the formal and informal arrangements that produce a degree of order and collective action above the state in the absence of the global government that involved coordination among state and non-state actors. That's according to Young in 1999. We'll focus on the United Nations as the primary venue and formal arrangement for global governance involving states and non-state actors. Now, global governance technically puts unity amidst diversity of actors or country in order to coordinate collective action for the benefit of the majority. The goal of the global governance is to provide global public goods, peace and security, justice and mediation system for conflict, just like the issue between Philippines and China regarding the dispute about the Scarborough Shoal. I know you're all familiar with that. Functioning markets and unified standards for trade and industry. As much as possible, the United Nations organization makes sure that the Philippines and China conflict will not end up with war. The United Nations right now is the leading institution in charge of the global governance, which was founded in 1945 after the Second World War, and that is to avoid any future conflicts. So since then, they have realized to have a peaceful world instead of war. So as of now, there are 193 members from its original of only 51 who make recommendations through United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations main mandate is to preserve global security, which it does through the Security Council. In addition, the United Nations can settle international legal issues through the International Court of Justice and implements its key decisions through the Secretariat, which is led by the Secretary General. Now, if the crime or problem is too much to be handled by the National Trial Court, the United Nations will take charge. They are the one to settle it. From security focus, the United Nations broadened its range of agencies and associated institutions, particularly to ensure greater shared prosperity as a desirable goal in itself and as an indirect way to increase global stability. To realize the initiative, the United Nations declared Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 for the future world. Aside from United Nations, there are also other institutions that play an important role in global governance, like the World Bank Organization and the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, mentioned a while ago by the previous speakers. They are to make sure that there is a regulation in the global economy and credit markets. Now, the United Nations serves as the primary organization for international cooperation, peace, and security. It is the only international organization that can authorize the use of force against an aggressor. So, kung di gid magpabadlong, gamitan na to iron fist. Charla. The United Nations as an organization can be a conflict actor in itself or an instrument for action driven by the interest of particular states. Yes, it can be a conflict itself because some leaders of major states that are in position in the United Nations can
can divert the focus of the organization to their self-interest, which can be, yes, a conflict and a threat also. The United Nations Charter established 6 principal organs in 1945. These organs are the Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, General Assembly, Security Council, and the Secretariat. And that can be found in the Article 7 of Chapter 3. And the Economic and Social Councils, or ECOSOC, primary objective is to advance the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. The IMF, or International Monetary Fund, and World Bank Organization issue yearly reports to the ECOSOC. Developed countries channel funding to these institutions because of the weight voting system of the IMF and the World Bank, contrary to the One Nation, which is one vote system found in the United Nations. That's according to Khan in 2011. Now, the Trusteeship Council was established to provide international supervision of the trust territories that are under the administration of 7 member states, to ensure that adequate steps are being made to prepare the people of trust territories for self-governance. So all 11 trust territories achieved independence in 1994. Now, the International Court of Justice is the United Nations principal judicial organ. Its role is to settle legal disputes between states and to provide advisory opinions on legal questions referred by the United Nations organs and specialized agencies in accordance to, of course, the international law. Now, next is the Security Council. It is the most potent or powerful organ of the United Nations, with the power to make legally binding resolutions. The Council is composed of 15 members. Among them would be the 5 states which are granted permanent seats. The 5 permanent members, or PM, also known as the Permanent 5 or P5, are first China, France, Great Britain, Russia, and of course the United States, all of which are allies in the Second World War and are nuclear states also. The remaining seats are for the 10 elected non-permanent members, or NPM, elected by the General Assembly for overlapping 2-year terms. So the 10 non-permanent seats are divided among regions. 5 seats from the African and Asian states, 1 seat from the Eastern European states, 2 states from the Latin American states, and the last 2 from Western European and other states. Article 24 of the United Nations Charter states that the Security Council is mandated to act on behalf of the entire United Nations body, which is to fulfill its primary responsibility for maintaining international peace, impose economic sanctions and other measures, determine the existence of peace and security, and functions may include investigating any situation that has the breach of peace and actions to be pursued. The structural feature of the Security Council, the power to veto of the permanent members to vote against a substantive resolution, serves as a measure to protect states from possible threats to independence and to ensure that the United Nations will not be used to serve the interests of a particular states only. Apart from this, there is also a 6th veto, or a hidden veto, of at least 7 non-permanent members of the Council. That's to prevent the 9 needed votes from reaching a decision. The voting system ideally aims to foster and emphasize the importance of unity, consensus, and compromise, which were not present in the League of Nations, where it was used to be an instrument by major powers to target Germany, Italy, Japan, and why countries such as the United States opted out from the membership. However, the United Nations Charter was never intended to espouse sovereign equality. The structural feature of the United Nations Charter veto is a result of an international compromise allied powers of Second World War, according to Carswell in 2013. Although the veto safeguards the sovereignty, it also serves as a severe problem, especially when major powers are directly or indirectly involved in the conflict, as it renders the body unable to take action to address the conflict, just like what happened in the Syrian armed conflict. To maintain the peace and order, the Security Council adopts a set of instruments such as sanctions, peacekeeping, and peace enforcement. Sanctions can take in forms of non-military measures of economic, trade, or diplomatic sanction, and targeted measures on groups or particular individuals, such as travel bans, financial and diplomatic restrictions. These are enforcement tools applied in when diplomatic relations have been fruitless. The threat to international security persists, and if deemed inadequate, military sanctions may be taken. Aside from the sanctions, peacekeeping is also a useful tool employed by the United Nations to assist host countries struggling from armed conflict. So the United Nations peacekeepers are deployed to provide security to population and political and peace-building support to countries' transition from conflict to peace. The first generation of classical peacekeeping from the 1950s to 1980s and the multidimensional and multilateral second generation were guided by the principles of consent, impartiality, and non-use of force except for self-defense. Now, next organ is the General Assembly. It is the only United Nations organ with universal representation, with all 93 member states represented in the body. The General Assembly decides on essential questions with a simple majority, while concerns related to peace and security, budgetary matters, and new members' admissions require a two-thirds majority vote. Yearly, the General Assembly meets for the annual General Assembly session and general debate participated by several heads of state. Moreover, the body also elects a General Assembly President and 21 Vice President, elected according to equitable geographical representation, every session for a one-year term. In reality, the Security Council remains to be the primary decision maker of the United Nations in all matters of international peace and security. However, the Uniting for Peace Resolution of 1950 ensures that divisive issues in the Security Council are blocking the members to take action may be assumed by the Assembly to bypass the vetoes of the Council and recommend measures including the use of force. This resolution, however, has been criticized for being unconstitutional as it allowed the Assembly to usurp the Security Council's primary role in maintaining international peace and security. That's again according to Carswell in 2013. Next is the Secretary General. It is the Chief Administrative Officer of the United Nations Secretariat. As stipulated in the Article 97, the Security Council sends a recommendation to the General Assembly, which will appoint the Secretary General for two 5-year terms at most. And Article 99 mandates the Secretary General to call for the attention of the members of the Security Council on threats to international peace and security, or when the inability of Security Council members to be responsive or to take responsibility is present. Now, Wallenstein in 2012 states that the three organs of the United Nations are interrelated in ways which support the viability of the United Nations. The shifting responsibilities of the three organs ensure that the organization will not collapse. However, since the Cold War, the Security Council has been paramount when it comes to decision making, leaving the other organs with little involvement and influence in the international issues. Now let's proceed to the reforming the United Nations. So there's no such thing as perfect organization or institution, but this reformation happens only once in 1963 during the expansion of the United Nations Security Council from 11 to 10 member states. Now in 1984, an open-ended working group on the question for equitable representation and increase in the membership of the Security Council was created, where members were invited to submit comments on the reformation and review of the Security Council. But since then, the negotiations have been fruitless, and it was dubbed as a never-ending working group for the endless years of consecutive deliberations, according to Gold and Gablin in 2017. Now, Gold and Gablin stated that there were two distinct sets of criticism relating to the efficiency of the council and the degree of equitable regarding power allocation. Personally, it was just like a national government setup, only that it happens in the international level. For the inequity in the country level, the problem lies in the overrepresentation of the permanent member countries. At the regional level, there is a lack of representation for Asia and Africa, while Eastern and Western Europe are overrepresented. Several demands have been presented by established of India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan in the G4 proposal calling for permanent seats in the Council, while smaller states demand equitable representation for the South. Contrary to these recurring demands, however, Gold and Roblin in 2017 called for the caution in pursuing structural reforms related to the expansion of the United Nations Security Council membership. Their quantitative appraisal shows that the United Nations Security Council membership enlargement is no remedy or resolution. It permits enhancement of equity and diminishing returns at the expense of efficiency at increasing returns. They find that reform of requiring two permanent member votes to constitute a veto would be more promising in improving both equity and efficiency and break the status quo. Furthermore, they also see the difficulty in finding a reform that would break the 20-year impasse in the negotiations. Because, human nature, people will always have something to say, and so the argument was never ending. The difficulty of the United Nations Security Council to include the rising powers into the power-sharing arrangement in the United Nations Security Council is due to the absence of the prospect for change. According to Hosley and Dorfler in 2017, this is brought by not only the diverging preferences of the permanent members, but also of a structural hurdles and the United Nations Charter lacking in the current institutional arrangement and preventing any reforms from seeping in. These institutional hurdles are the Permanent 5 inclusion requirement and the two-thirds majority requirement in the United Nations General Assembly substantive decisions. The likelihood of reform to succeed depends on the feasibility of acquiring the necessary support and votes. If this will not be resolved in the near future, which is a real challenge, the reforms remain unforeseeable and cannot be done. The resolution ought to be fully realized and maximized, for it has to be bestowed the Assembly the capacity to check the Security Council in its proper and rightful exercise of veto in accordance to what is mandated by the United Nations Charter. Now, let's proceed to the formation of an Asian interstate system. We can obtain matrices of interstate relationship in Asia by accumulating all of the bilateral diplomatic relationships and 6 cases of which were observed. The matrices render us some findings on the formation and deformation of an interstate system in East Asia. Mid-1960s, the framework of the Cold War was dominant in the region, where the communist and the liberal blocs were clearly demarcated. In the mid-1970s, especially after the unification of Vietnam in 1976, some kind of an interstate systems should have been formed on the initiative of ASEAN member states. However, it was the invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam at the end of 1978 that destroyed the new dynamism. As a result, in the 1980s, Vietnam and Cambodia under Heng Samrin's and Hun Sen's premiership respectively came to be isolated from the rest of the Asian countries. The emergent system in Asia became very chaotic. However, since the end of the 1980s, Japan, China, Thailand, and other ASEAN members practiced a kind of concerted diplomacy, persuading that Vietnam should withdraw its military forces from Cambodia and political factions in Cambodia should cooperate with each other to restore order in an appropriate way. Eventually, Vietnamese forces withdrew back home in September 1989, and in Cambodia, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, or UNTAC, was set up in March 1992 as an intermediary for the nation rebuilding. So September in the next year, the Kingdom of Cambodia started anew. That's a good thing. In the 1990s, locally the detente in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, and globally in the Cold War and the domestic as well as international collapse of the former Soviet bloc, brought about the conditions that enabled East Asia to construct an interstate system based on equality. In the late 1990s, the system appeared on the surface, provided that Taiwan enjoyed not formal or political, but informal, which is economic and cultural relations with all nations in the region, and that North Korea had diplomatic relations with Asian nations, except South Korea, Japan, and Myanmar. Thus, in principle, a network of diplomatic relations is well established, connecting almost all nations in East Asia. The basis of the Asian system is a modified version of the Western state system, as the pioneer deprived of the function of Western dominance. The Western state system was quintessentially Western-centric, where legitimate actors were limited to the sovereign states in the West. While it brought development, wealth, and state building to Western nations, it destroyed non-Western nations in terms of politics, economics, society, and culture. The system embraced a practical code of interstate behavior, compromising a double standard of behavioral code, one applied to Western nations and the other to the non-Western nations. While Western nations acted as equal to other in the principle, they treated polities outside the West in such discriminatory ways as they considered appropriate. The core of the inward code was threefold. First is national sovereignty, the balance of power, and international law. The ideal type of states was nation-states. Dependent on the outward code, the Westerner would never easily admit that the non-Western nations also have sovereignty. The Western regarded non-Western nations as a target of Western mercantilism, colonialism, and imperialism. So, moreover, they tried to destroy any indigenous industrializations in the rest of the world, particularly that in Asia, which had been far more ahead of the West in this respect up until the mid-18th century. Globally speaking, the 1960s was epoch-making in the international system, as was expressed in such significant incidents as the emergence of African years, the finding of the North and South problem, the impasse of the nuclear stalemate, or the assertion of the international interdependence. In the current international system, the outward code in the Western state system has ceased to function, and equality principle applies to all states. Association of Southeast Asian Nation. We talked about the United Nations. Now let's get more specific. Let's go to the region of the Southeast Asia. Now, ASEAN or Southeast Asian Nation was established on 8th of August in 1967 in Bangkok by the 5 original member countries, which are Indonesia, Malaysia, our very own Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. But Brunei Darussalam joined on the 8th of January in 1984, Vietnam on 28th of July in 1995, Laos and Myanmar on 23rd of July in 1997, and Cambodia on 30th of April year 1999. The ASEAN Declaration states that the aims and purpose of the association are, first, to accelerate the economic growth, social progress, and cultural development in the region through joint endeavors in the spirit of equality and partnership in order to strengthen the foundation for a prosperous and peaceful community of Southeast Asian nations. And second, to promote regional peace and stability through abiding respect for justice and the rule of law in the relationship among countries in the region and adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter. Now, in 1995, the ASEAN heads of state and government reaffirmed that cooperative peace and shared prosperity shall be the fundamental goals of ASEAN. Fundamental principles, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation or TAC in Southeast Asia, signed at the first ASEAN Summit on 24th of February in 1976, declared that in their relations with one another, the high contracting parties should be guided by the following fundamental principles. First, mutual respect for the independence, sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, and national identity of all nations. Second, the right of every state to lead its national existence free from external interference, subversion, or coercion. Third, non-interference in the internal affairs of one another. Fourth, settlement of differences or disputes by peaceful manner. Fifth, renunciation of the threat or use of force. And lastly, effective cooperation among themselves. Now, talking about political cooperation, the TAC stated that ASEAN political and security dialogue and cooperation should aim to promote regional peace and stability by enhancing regional resilience. The regional resilience shall be achieved by cooperating in all fields based on the principles of self-confidence, self-reliance, mutual respect, cooperation, and solidarity, which shall constitute the foundation for a strong and viable community of nations in the Southeast Asia. Some of the major political accords to ASEAN are as follows. ASEAN Declaration in Bangkok on the 8th of August in 1967. Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality Declaration in Kuala Lumpur, that's 27th of November in 1971. Declaration of ASEAN Concord in Bali, Indonesia in on 24th of February in 1976, Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in the Southeast Asia, Bali in 24th of February in 1976, the ASEAN Declaration of the South China Sea in Manila, that was in 22nd of July in 1992, the Treaty of the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone in Bangkok on 15th of December in 1997, ASEAN Vision 2020 in Kuala Lumpur on 15th of December in 1997, Declaration on Joint Action to Encounter Terrorism on the 5th of November year 2001, Declaration of ASEAN Concord Part 2 in Bali, Indonesia, that's on 7th of October in 2003, ASEAN Convention on Counterterrorism or ACCT on the 11th of January year 2007, Cebu Declaration on the Acceleration of the Establishment of ASEAN Community by 2015 on 11th of January 2007. On top of that, ASEAN Declaration on Joint Action to Counter Terrorism on the 5th of November in 2001, and Joint Declaration of the ASEAN Defense Ministers on Promoting Defense Cooperation for Dynamic ASEAN Community on 25th of May in 2016. Although ASEAN states cooperate mainly on the economic and social issues, the organization has a security function with a long-discussed program for confidence-building measures and for establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in Southeast Asia with the objective of implementing ASEAN's 1971 Declaration of Zone, Freedom and Neutrality or ZOPFAN and Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone or SEANWFZ, which would be a component of ZOPFAN. So that's the end of my discussion of this topic. I hope you learned something. I'm open for any questions if you happen to have any.
Thank you so much, Governor Anna Kim. I believe all of us have learned a lot. This time, you guys know the drill. Let us proceed immediately to the open forum. Any questions? Reactions rather, or insights perhaps? Miss Aileen Rose, you are acknowledged.
Yes, thank you. I am, and we are honored to have listened to your discussion, Governor. I agree with your point that in order to organize collective action for the benefit of the majority, global governance technically creates harmony among diverse actors or countries. And my question, ma'am, is how can we explore the interconnectedness of global systems through a closer look at some of the world's pressing issues, their impact on global.
I think Miss Aileen is having a hard time with her internet connection, but I have gotten her question, so I'll be raising it to you, Gov Anna. Is it okay? In behalf of Miss Aileen. So her question was, how can we explore the interconnectedness of global systems through a closer look at some of the world's most pressing global issues and their impact on children? That's her question po.
All right. Thank you so much for that question. So, the capacity to comprehend and perform in an increasingly multicultural, multinational, but interrelated world is referred to as global interconnectedness. It encourages people to grow into effective professionals, civic leaders, and well-informed citizens in a varied national and global community. And it also can lead to helping each other to find solutions to global issues and how we can create a better future for our, of course, the younger generation. I hope I have answered your question. Dylan.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miss Elan, for your question. And Gov Anna, thank you for your response and for the comprehensive discussion as well. I really liked what you've said that we are aiming for the welfare of our children. And yeah, I really I do agree with that statement. Once again, I would like to thank our guest speakers in today's webinar for sharing with us their knowledge, their wisdom about the structures of globalization. And also, thank you for the very responsive attendees and reactors that have joined us here today. Before we end, I would like to ask our guest speakers, Chief Kimberly, Doc Aladil, and Gov Anna, do you have your final words before we end our webinar for this afternoon?
Thank you for having me as one of your speakers for today's Global Talk. It was my honor to share about the global economy and its various concepts and ideas. And this topic is very meaningful and crucial for us to be knowledgeable as to how the economic world works. Again, thank you especially to you, Miss Jem.
Thank you so much, Chief Kimberly. You know, it's really a an opportunity, a once in a lifetime opportunity to talk with the NEDA chief herself. So thank you for your presence this afternoon, Miss Kimberly, and for the very informative discussion that you've shared with all of us here. Let's proceed to Doc Aladil. Do you have any final message for us, Doc?
I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all of you here for inviting me and for making this event since it is really relevant and informative to the students. And I would just like to say to our viewers, nga laban ng jud permi, to especially to your studies right now, kalisod jud ang ato ang kahimtang karon. So yeah, that's all.
Yes, hearing these words from the USEC president herself, it's very comforting. You know, laban lang ta guys for our viewers who are students, laban. And for Gov Anna, your last words, final message for the viewers.
Yeah, I would like to thank everyone who stayed up until the last part of the um, this webinar, this talk, and I'm very honored to be here. That's why I would like to apologize. I've been so busy that a while ago I kept getting in and out because I was called for a meeting with the international organizations. But of course, I can't leave you guys alone, especially that this topic that I have mentioned a while ago about um, international system and this global governance. Some may think, especially the young people, some may think that that's too broad. That's something that's not really relatable for us right now because we're in the local. Well, I want to tell you this. We are not talking about this because this is part of the students, but because we are part of this. We have to care, we have to know about this because we are involved. So keep reminding yourself of that. Again, thank you so much for having me here.
Wow, I totally agree with what Gov Anna said. You know, it's not about um, it doesn't matter if you are a student, if you are a normal citizen, because we are involved, or we live in one world, so we really have to be involved with what's happening around us. All right, to express our heartfelt gratitude towards our guest speakers, I would like to honor them with this virtual certificate of appreciation. I would like to request our USEP staff to please present to us the certificates of recognition, appreciation, rather. All right, the certificate of appreciation is proudly presented to Chief Kimberly Joyce Ali for being the guest speaker in the Global Talk. Chief Ali, thank you so much once again for accepting the invitation, and we do really appreciate you.
Yeah, it was
Another,
my
yes, thank you so much, Chief. Another certificate of appreciation is given to Dr. Aldil Jane Shannon Alejandrino, the president of the University of Southeast Eastern Philippines, for being the guest speaker in today's Global Talk. Thank you so much again, Doc Aladil.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And another certificate of appreciation is given to the one and only Governor Anna Kim Bangius for being the guest speaker for today's Global Talk as well. Gov Anna, thank you so much. We appreciate your effort. I know that you are really busy at this point, so thank you so much for your presence.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. Laban lang kita. Okay, usap
Laban.
ang tanan.
That's right, Laban. And another certificate of appreciation is given to, next certificate please. I think the use of staff is here. Yeah, I see it already. Certificate of appreciation is proudly presented to Jasper, June, and Doy for attending the Global Talk. And of course, we appreciate your voice, your talent. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, Jasper. It's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually hear your voice during the Global Talk webinar. Thank you,
so much,
Jasper. Yeah,
I'm
thank you
stating-
so much. We'll invite him again next time during our next webinar. Do we have any more certificates? I think we have still another one. Next, please. Yes! Certificate of participation is proudly presented to Aileen Rose Antipastro for attending the Global Talk. Thank you so much, Ms. Aileen, for your very nice questions and insights earlier together with Mr. Jasper. Thank you so much for your attending. Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Aileen. Also, we thank all the viewers, all the listeners, all the people who are joining us today in our Global Talk webinar. Thank you so much for your presence, guys. Without all of you, any of this will not happen. Any of this will not be possible. So thank you so much. I hope that you have learned something from the session. I know that you have gained a very good insights that you will bring with you in this lifetime. All right, once again, I am your host, Jemima Kija V. Bernido. Thank you once again for joining us. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you next time. Bye!